Welcome to the We Rise podcast, where we are building collective resilience. I'm your host, Christine Gouvet, business owner, wife, mother of two, paddleboarder, and I love working with communities across the nation. Join me as I share stories and strategies to inspire action to build resilience and community transformation. From the Navajo Nation to the mountains of Appalachia, incredible work is being done by community members and leaders. I'm excited to share more on the podcast today. Welcome. Welcome back to the Yes, We Rise podcast, all. So glad that you're here. I'm excited to share this conversation with Hannah Gibbs with you. Hannah is the Workforce Development Program Manager and Farmer Pride Coalition Coordinator at Appalachia Sustainable Development, which is based in Southwest Virginia and serves Central Appalachia. Hannah is an Eastern Kentucky native with personal roots in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, and has a deep passion for the future of the region. Hannah completed her bachelor's in environmental studies at Centre College and her master's of public affairs and sustainable development at Indiana University in 2021. Hannah is a delight to talk to, and I can't wait for you to hear about the tremendous work that Hannah's doing across the region. Welcome back all to the We Rise podcast. Hope all of you are well today. I am delighted to have Hannah Gibbs joining me today. Hannah, will you introduce yourself so folks know who I have the delight of speaking to today?
Hi, my name is Hannah Gibbs. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Appalachia Sustainable Development, centered in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia with their workforce development program, Groundwork.
Tell us a little bit about what you do at Appalachia Sustainable Development, and then would love to ask you to tell us more about your story. So feel free to start with your story or what you're up to now. How'd you get to, be doing what you're up to today?
Yeah, I think maybe it might be best to start at the beginning. I'm from Eastern Kentucky originally, from London, Kentucky, more specifically, and we've got family kind of all over the eastern part of the state. So the Appalachian Mountain part of Kentucky, if you're not familiar with Kentucky. I have family who, come from a history, I guess, of teachers, and then my dad was a public defender. So a lot of work centered on the realities of Eastern Kentucky, which is an area that has experienced a lot of intergenerational and historical poverty as a result of the coal mining industry coming in and leaving. A lot of environmental devastation in the region that I didn't realize, I don't think, had impacted me to the scope that it had until I went to college. My first semester of college, I went to Centre College in Danville, so it's a little school in the central Kentucky, and I went there in my very first semester. I went with the expectation of being a lawyer at the end of 4 years. I wanted to go to law school. That was really the goal, major in political science, maybe take some classes in environmental studies because it seemed interesting. But I took environmental studies my first semester. I had an really extraordinary experience and an extraordinary professor at the time who helped me realize that the parts of environmental studies that were really impactful to me that I hadn't realized were considered parts of environmental studies, because it's always emphasized as environmental science, were really the stories of people. So when I think of home and when I think of Eastern Kentucky and I think about the story of Eastern Kentucky, it's so much of identity tied back to coal and identity tied back to the landscape and the mountains. But it's all centered in the people of Eastern Kentucky, which is really just the cornerstone of my own identity, and my family's identity. I think about my mother's history and everyone emailing me. When I think about all of that happening and all the pieces of things that make me myself and have led to this story, I realized really in that very first class that that's what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be doing work for and in Appalachia, which was home to me and which had given me so much. And I wanted to be able to come back and really make a meaningful impact. So I knew that I needed more information. I needed to know what I was doing. There's a lot of harm that's been done in Appalachia for folks trying to change things without having a lot of strong backing and knowing what's going on, or having external influences that may not have the best interest of the region in mind. So I went to school, changed my major to environmental studies fully. Knew pretty quickly I didn't want to do law school, that I wanted to do something else. I couldn't really place what that was at the time. And kind of moved through, did a lot of work, environmental policy studies, did a lot of the science side, which was interesting. It's never been my strong suit, but I learned to love it. Really got a lot of development and a lot of interest in talking about transportation systems, housing systems, all the things that are in crisis in a lot of parts of Appalachia. were the things that interested me. And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. When you see the social problems, it becomes an awareness. Got a pretty robust as well, social justice involvement through the Bonner Scholars Program, which is an income-based scholarship program that the college offers. It started actually at Berea College, also in Eastern Kentucky, to provide opportunities for students to go to school. But the curriculum through Bonner is very centered on social justice, on development, personal and professional development for people, so that you're able to make a better, more effective, and more equitable impact in the work that you do. So I was finishing school at Center. We had done kind of a culinary project my senior year of a whole year of events related to Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia that I was facilitating. So we had speakers come in. We had done a series of workshops. The really fantastic team that I was able to work with, and done so much investment back into where I was from. And I knew also where I wanted to go, right? I wanted to go back. The question about Appalachia always is, where are the jobs, right? And I couldn't really answer that question. At the time in Eastern Kentucky, there's a lot of economic devastation. So it's difficult to imagine a future in a place where one is hardly ever talked about, right, by people who are discussing it. So my thought at the end was, I feel like I still need something more. So I applied and actually was accepted to teach for America for their Appalachia Corps, and almost became a teacher for a couple of years. My mother was actually a teacher for more than 30 years in Eastern Kentucky, and then a principal as well, and had done a ton of great work. But it didn't feel like necessarily the right fit. And I really wanted to center myself in the sustainability world, because that's where I had moved to, talking about not only the impact of coal mining, but of global climate change and everything else that was really coming to a head, all the conversations at that time. And then also looking at how socially a lot of the blame for things like climate change were steeped on Appalachia and the coal industry and coal mining, and where, there's a lot of validity in that. Coal is devastating on the environment, the burning of coal. But at the same time, on the back end of that are huge numbers of people, the entire region, family members and friends, and my whole community who were left behind, talking about transition. So it's like, yes, we're moving away from coal, but we're not investing back in Appalachia. So being able to consider that really complicated dichotomy, I think, of what was going on. So I decided to go to graduate school, and I went to Indiana University, their School of Public and Environmental Studies, and pursued a degree actually in public administration with an emphasis on sustainable development and sustainable finance.
Cool.
I started there in 2019. Really enjoyed the class. It gave me a really formal structure for being able to do a lot of things, looking at investments in particular. What does a strong investment look like? How do you build a project to make it appealing to folks to be able to want to invest in? And not only money, but, their time, their interest, and their capital. And looking at Eastern Kentucky, when you've had a lot of folks come in and then leave and take advantage of the people who were there, or they're profit farming in a lot of different ways, and then pull out without leaving, that investment behind, that can be a hard sell. And it's an important one to acknowledge that kind of historical legacy in Eastern Kentucky. But graduate school gave me a lot of opportunity to really dive deep into my interests in Eastern Kentucky, talking about food systems in particular. Every class I took my last semester of graduate school, which was fully online because of the pandemic, was about food systems. So that was wild. Learned a lot about food policy and how we get to where we are, and the sort of lack of infrastructure that exists for rural communities. And for Eastern Kentucky and the rest of Appalachia, which are hyper rural communities in a lot of ways, that's just exacerbated every problem, that comes through. And it's like, this is a broken piece of the food system. And then you get to, certain urban areas and then certain very rural areas, and it's just extreme because of the problem that starts small just continues to grow with a lack of access in every way. So that was, I knew then I wanted to come home. I was ready to be working in Appalachia. It was the middle of the pandemic, and I didn't really know the best way to approach it. And so I spent some time kind of job searching, and that wasn't getting me a ton of places because I didn't really know where to look. And I didn't really know what organizations to work with, because again, like I mentioned earlier, that's something you really do have to be careful with, I think, a lot of times. So I was looking at Americorp, and that's actually how I found where I am currently. I
Mm-hmm.
started a VISTA position with Appalachian Sustainable Development as their Sustainability and Equity VISTA for the Workforce Development Program. So Groundwork, this is what I'm doing now. This is a long-winded road, but Groundwork is the Workforce Development Program for Appalachian Sustainable Development. And what Groundwork does is provide paid on-the-job skills training for people with barriers to employment.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means is that folks who are coming through the program are folks who are experiencing any manner of things. And that can be one of our most common, for example, is past criminal justice involvement,
Mm-hmm.
substance use disorder recovery. We've had folks who haven't worked, in 40 years, they've been out of the workforce, or folks who've never had a job before at all.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the range of stuff. We have mental health barriers, we have physical disability barriers, whatever those look like for folks who are coming through the program and might be keeping them from pursuing employment, um, provide paid skills training for, and a pretty robust professional development curriculum to get them back into the workforce in whatever direction they want to be headed. If
Mm-hmm.
that's education, if that's future work, if that's family relationships, whatever they're looking for, we try to help provide support for that in the program.
Mm-hmm.
So I started ASD as a VISTA, worked for a year in that role,
Mm-hmm.
looking at our sustainability programming, looking at our diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, doing a lot of build up there, and then transitioned into a full-time position at the end of my VISTA term, doing training and professional development support for trainees who were in the program. So I met a lot with the trainees individually. We're able to talk through, what are your goals? Where do you want to
Mm-hmm.
be at the end of this program? Where do you want to be in 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes for our folks and for, in reality, a lot of people across Appalachia who are facing these kind of intergenerational barriers or really extreme barriers to not only employment, but other pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a question folks are asked a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And that was a realization I had a long time ago with, the children at my mom's school when she was
Mm-hmm.
teaching. It's not that they didn't think college was important, it's that it wasn't ever considered an option.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And same thing with work or same thing with jobs. It's hard to imagine a future when no one really talks about having one or
Right.
what one could be.
Yeah.
Um, so that was what I did all last year. And then now in January, my amazing supervisor announced her retirement.
Mm.
So I applied for her position and was hired to
Neat.
be the program manager. Yeah, so I'm
Awesome.
I'm now our manager of our groundwork program. So this is our
Awesome.
my first season in
Mm-hmm.
this kind of role, and I am just ecstatic. We actually onboard folks
Cool.
in a couple of weeks
Uh-huh.
for our summer cohorts in our gardens and in our warehouse. Um, in addition to that, sorry, I got
You're
over
good.
there.
Yeah.
In addition to that, my other role at ASD is really involved in our diversity, equity, and inclusion
Mm-hmm.
initiatives, helping with that committee, but also was able to start with a lot of fantastic support from the organization and from community members, our Farmer Pride Coalition.
Mm.
So that is a coalition for LGBTQ plus farmers, growers, gardeners, agroforesters, whoever might be involved in ag in the Appalachian region. We didn't have really a great support network for our farmers who identify as LGBTQ plus.
Mm-hmm.
And for myself, that's every community that I'm a part of, as part of the LGBTQ plus community, part of the Appalachian community, part of the
Mm-hmm.
agriculture community.
Mm-hmm.
That was a really vital thing for me. So that's
Mm.
actually, we launched on January 1 of this year. And
Oh,
so I'm the
cool.
coordinator for that coalition. Yeah,
That's
thanks.
awesome. And is that particular program, Hannah, across different organizations, or how do folks learn more about that program and get involved? It's
That's a
such
great
a,
question.
yeah, I love that there wasn't a place for people to gather. You've created one. Now, how do they get involved?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking. So it's housed under ASD as one of our offerings. And what we do is really try to link in folks with all of our programming and then all of our support organizations that we have connections with across the region. So we have an active website, and then it's all present on our ASD social media, which is at AS Develop everywhere. And I'll share as well the link to the website so that folks
Great.
can see upcoming events because we'd love to have
Awesome.
folks out.
Yeah, I love that. I love that that's happening and you're 2 months in and that's so cool. So I want to go. So first of all, thank you for sharing your story. You know, the grounding, the awareness, the change. You talked a couple times about something that is just so, I think, essential about imagining a future. And you talked about in Eastern Kentucky that didn't necessarily happen a lot. You know, people talk about jobs, but you know, being able to envision what's there, as you've already said, Hannah, is really a key part in being able to envision your place in it. And in my work with communities, often it's needing to have that place to come together that feels safe, that feels inclusive, that feels also open and generative, and that new folks can come to the table. That space is really an essential place for people to envision what their future looks like, build those connections, and then start to move towards possibility. So you talked about it in your own life, and then you also talked about it with the community members that you're working with the Groundworks program. Can you talk a little bit about what in your experience, Hannah, what does it allow that envisioning to happen? Where do people, you know, there's kind of when people especially are struggling to put food on the table, it's hard to then think about, well, what do I want the future of my community to look like in 20 years or in 50 years? What does that process look like in your experience, in your own life or in community members you work with, to imagine that future?
So thinking about what makes the most impact from the Groundwork program, and I know maybe non-framing, but I think it's really the place to start, is not necessarily the hard skills development that we do, because we do train folks to, how to garden and grade produce. They might, graduate with different certifications and different things, and all of that is phenomenal and helps them, be employable. But I think the biggest thing that it does is what our staff is able to do by working directly with folks one-on-one, is provide information on what the process can look like for building a future.
Mm.
I think there's such a gap in knowledge because it's not emphasized. If you are in the public education system from a very young age and aren't doing exceptionally well, if you've been identified as probably not going to college, if
Mm-hmm.
that's however that looks, and it looks different in every state and every school system, um, then a lot of the times the emphasis becomes, okay, you need to graduate high school. And that seems like the end of the line for
Mm-hmm.
learning.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that becomes the model
Mm-hmm.
for learning that folks have. It's not, when you're 18, you're done. And that's the future, right? After
Mm-hmm.
that, it might look like a job or might look like something else. So being able to talk through process and being able to say, here's what someone's always wanted to do, and being
Mm-hmm.
able to build rapport to get to the answer to that question. And for a lot of our folks, it's gardening. They want to be able to
Mm-hmm.
grow their own food, or they want to be self-sufficient, or they might be interested in market gardening or farming.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to figure that out, and then being able to say, okay, here are concrete steps that need to happen,
Mm-hmm.
in order for this to be successful. And that might look like higher education, or that might look like finishing, a GED, or that
Mm-hmm.
might look like being enrolled in, we had some folks who did a therapeutic horticulture course online because that's really what they're interested in. And giving people a foundation to stand on, a support system to come back to, and the language around what they need in order to succeed.
Yeah.
And for everything, for everybody, that's such a huge disparity between folks who know that already, right? You come in because maybe your parents have experience or you've got an older sibling, and then the folks who aren't as aware of those things from the start.
Yeah. So it sounds like the relationship is also a kind of a core element of it within the Groundwork program. It sounds like it's that one-on-one relationship building that is taking place.
Mhm.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
is
So all of our trainees have a supervisor. So we have trainees are folks in groups of 3 to 4, sometimes 5,
mm-hmm.
with a direct supervisor that's based on their site location. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, we have a garden in Abingdon, Virginia, and
Mm-hmm.
we have a site supervisor there, and currently 3 people enrolled in that program. So they work directly 4 days a week with their site supervisor there on site. And then 1 day a week, they also work with our personal and professional development manager
Mm-hmm.
to really work through all of those kind of questions. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's helping folks get enrolled in school or whatever that looks like. And that was my position last year.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a real um, honor, I think, and privilege, and honestly, a great time to get to work with
Yeah.
folks regularly one-on-one and get to
Mm-hmm.
know the people in our program and their visions and hopes for
Yeah.
themselves and the community and their
Yeah.
families and everything
Mm-hmm.
else that they're really
Mm-hmm.
tied into.
So essential. So I hear that one-on-one relationships. You also, it sounds like, had a sense of joy working one-on-one with folks and getting to know them. And then you also talked, Hannah, about what it looks like to be able to just have that continued lifelong learning and how important that is with not even the cultural expectation that it maybe stops at age 18 or yes, college or no college, but it's this culture of openness. You almost, it sounded, you didn't use that language, but it's that what framing things in the realm of possibility. What do you want to do? How do you, grow your ideas and the skills and resources around that? So it sounds like you're creating opportunity, both within and externally. Can you talk a little bit about where you see that framing of possibility, either with Farmer Pride or with, folks you're working with? What is your vision more for the region, Hannah, in terms of how to bring that realm of possibility or imagining the future? Where are you hoping the region's going to go? That's a big question, but kind of along a similar trajectory.
Yeah, oh, I love that question.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the future of Appalachia is one of my favorite things, I must say. So that's lovely. But I think one of the big things for me is thinking about the celebration of all the beauty that has existed in Appalachia in the past
Mm-hmm.
that is often not talked about. I mean, even I've been talking about it and framing it like there's a lot of damage that's been done to
Mm-hmm.
Appalachia and its people.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's so much joy here in the
Mm-hmm.
mountains,
Mm-hmm.
the
I love that.
community prevalence towards mutual aid, I think, is a great example for both
Mm-hmm.
specifically the LGBTQ plus community
Mm-hmm.
and the Appalachian community at large. Like I think about my grandfather grew a garden for years and we fed tons of people out of that garden.
Mm-hmm.
But he had the land and a little bit of time to do it, and it was able to make such a difference so that folks, could have access to fresh food or food,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and just be able to engage with that and be able to build community and to meet
Mm-hmm.
people's needs in a place that didn't have a lot of external support.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that when places like that exist, and Appalachia, I think, is a good example, when there's a lack of support externally or otherwise, that's when the community has really come together.
Mm-hmm.
There's an idea of family in Appalachia. You have your family that you're related to, and I've got a large one. But you
Mm-hmm.
also have your family, which is your community,
Mm-hmm.
that you're able to build. That's an idea, I think, really prevalent in the Appalachian LGBTQ plus community, thinking
Mm-hmm.
about mutual aid and food and agriculture, kind of at its roots is when you didn't have access to food, or maybe it wasn't safe, to go certain places, you had your community, right, that could keep you fed or could
Mm-hmm.
keep you in clothes or whatever that looked like, to meet basic needs and to meet social needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for folks to have that structure of support,
Right.
it's similar for groundwork, being able to provide a support structure for people that's dependable, and that can be relied on when things get
Mm-hmm.
difficult, I think is extremely necessary for everyone.
Yeah.
And that's what the future looks like. For me, a bright future for Appalachia is one that's rooted in that really ingrained value of what community can be,
Mm.
which is centered on love and centered on joy and centered on the abilities of the people here to support one another,
Wow.
which I'm very proud to be a part of and
Mm-hmm.
very happy exists.
Building collective resilience looks different in different places. What stories and strategies inspire you? Share your ideas with us on social media and check out our website at yeswerise.org to find the show notes, interview videos, and the links mentioned on the podcast today. What I also hear to some degree in that, you talked about that your family is the family you grew up with or inherited in some way, but it's also your community. And there's kind of two elements of that. And being able to feel that, and that is a felt body sense, at least in my own experience, when you can really depend on that community and rely on that community and know when you fall, because we all will inevitably fall, there's that support system there to catch you. And I love the way you brought that in with the LGBTQIA plus community, as well as within Groundwork, and then just across Appalachia. So you talked about it's an ingrained value of love and joy, but feeling that system of support seems like would really help grow a sense of trust to be able to move out in the world and do what people want to do, if that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit more about the ways that you're hoping to continue to grow? There's so much joy in the mountains. You said, what is continuing to grow those values of love and joy, and what you're seeing in the future of Appalachia? How do you see the region moving towards that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think talking in the framework that's used a lot of times in Appalachia, which is just transition, or the
Mhm.
transition from a coal-based economy in a justice-centered way to the future of Appalachia. And thinking about ASD, the approach that ASD is taking, and I'm very grateful to be at ASD and that I found the organization, is an agriculture-centered approach. Because
Mm.
at the core of agriculture is self-empowerment,
Mhm.
and that's what ASD does. So finding, those, not industries is not the right word, but finding those pathways for folks
Mhm.
to develop pieces of self-empowerment and community empowerment. For every every tomato plant that's planted, that feeds a family or that feeds a group of people. We donate a lot of our produce to the food pantry that's nearby one of our gardens. But looking at um, that future of self-empowerment that's rooted in agriculture, when I think of the future of Appalachia, that's what's there. It's
Mm.
that all the licensing and all the restrictions that have been placed on the region because of the environmental loss or because of the just the change that's occurred
Mhm.
economically speaking,
Mhm.
that those are rectified through things that emphasize self-empowerment. So that's education, that's agriculture, that's autonomy, related to being able to make choices about healthcare and being able to make choices about family and being able to do these things for ourselves, but also ingrained and just a part of our community.
Mhm.
There's a lot of power in being able to feed yourself and your street, I think is a good framework for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's so foundational in so many ways. Yeah. So when you think ahead about, so you're creating places of belonging through Farmer Pride, through your work with Groundwork. What are some of the things you're hoping to work on in the next couple years, broader years, to continue to grow that sense of belonging and joy throughout Appalachia?
Love that question. We right now we're exploring, how do we address one of the biggest barriers for our folks to be involved in agriculture and kind of reach that stage of um, self-actualization, or
Mm-hmm.
self-satisfaction with what they want to do with ag. And one of the big barriers is land access.
Mm-hmm.
So making sure that the folks who want to be involved in ag have the space to do it,
Mm-hmm.
and are meeting, the regenerative practices that help our environment at the same time. So that's one thing is we're looking at how to expand land so that when folks graduate from the groundwork program, if they need that support for their next steps, then maybe they've got land, that they can go to and they can start
Mm-hmm.
gardening with our still existing support structure,
Mm-hmm.
for the education pieces because our program is phenomenal. And I will never say anything but amazing things about it, but it's hard to learn to farm, in a
Mm-hmm.
short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
It takes years of learning. There's a constant learning curve and new things that are being developed. And I think that's part of what most excites me about agriculture is that it is kind of a stage of constant learning. But,
Mm-hmm.
in order to do that, folks will need support.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to transition and provide that space for folks on such a just a basic level,
Mm-hmm.
have the land to grow
Yeah.
um, is a big piece of what we're looking for moving forward. Being able to emphasize education in a formal or non-formal setting is
Mm-hmm.
a big next step for us. Making sure that folks know what the options are.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need a degree for? What would you want a degree for?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that kind of reality look like? Or maybe it's not a degree. Maybe it's a
Mm-hmm.
certification or just a class enrollment that you might want to know in order to
Mm-hmm.
be more successful. And then for Farmer Pride, I think being able to expand um, and be more inclusive of folks from across the region so that more folks know what we're doing and
Mm-hmm.
they feel like there is a space that's accessible for members of the LGBTQ plus community to come and gather, that there is an acknowledgement of the contribution of the LGBTQ plus community to
Mm-hmm.
agriculture in the region,
Mm-hmm.
which is not emphasized really, but I think is very important to acknowledge and think about and to consider, when thinking about building systems for support, um, how our farmers and Farmer Pride can support other members of the LGBTQ plus community who maybe have never considered agriculture as an option because they've never seen themselves reflected in agriculture.
Yeah. So huge to be able to, see that other folks just like me are doing this. I can do this as well. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like to drill down into the agriculture level a little bit more and regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming practices, land access? We've seen in the last couple decades since there's been this real resurgence around a focus of local foods in a couple different ways and people who have gotten engaged in farming. And then the support mechanisms aren't necessarily in place to be able to sustain their bodies or to continue to earn a wage or to, continue to recognize the true cost of growing food. So that longevity in agriculture is hard for some people. At least that's what I've seen in my work and in communities. But yes, it's such an essential thing. And it's really one of the most everyday relatable things that people can do to grow a more sustainable future is to grow or purchase locally grown, sustainably raised food. So what does that look like in terms of, can you talk at a little bit more everyday level about how your work with ASD or the Groundwork program helps connect, create connections for land access, and how to support people over time, over that arc of growing? And then lastly, the regenerative practices. Tell us a little bit about what those growing practices look like.
Yeah, so ASD has a couple of things I think that are extremely relevant to this question because you're absolutely right. Being able to do something sustainably is the only way to do it. Having someone being able to farm for 5 years and then having to stop is not sustainable for the land or for the people. So ASD's kind of core social enterprise is our Appalachian Harvest Food Hub. And the way it works is we have farmers from across the region who bring their produce to Appalachian Harvest, and then we're able to store and ship and sell it at higher prices. So for a basic model, if you've got one farmer who can grow 20 boxes of squash, that's not enough to sell to a place like Food City or Walmart, for sale or retail sale. But if you've got 30 farmers who've each got 20 boxes of squash, you can aggregate that produce and sell it wholesale retail price, which is a much higher value, right, than you would get selling it like a farmer's market or something else, and allows for agriculture to be an actual career. So if you're able to get the right price for your produce, it allows you to stay in business, right, and make enough of a profit to sustain yourself and your farm and your enterprise. So that's what our Appalachian Harvest Food Hub does, is it centers the family farm and centers agriculture in Appalachia by providing a mechanism for our farmers to be able to support themselves sustainably through our purchase of produce. So that's kind of the big thing. And then ASD also operates what's called our producer pathway. So that identifies the education levels for agriculture producers and agroforestry producers from beginning all the way to mentor level. So if you're, and you can identify yourself along the pathway. We have a couple mechanisms for that on our website. So if you're just getting started in farming, or you're even just considering growing a garden for the first time, you might be at that very beginning level. If you've been at it for a couple of years and you're thinking, okay, maybe I've done tomatoes or pumpkin farming, I want to do no-till or other, conservation practices, then you might be an intermediate farmer. And then we've got identified resources for that stage as well. If you've been doing this for 30 years, you've expanded, you've got livestock or small ruminants and plants, and you're wanting to really be able to support the agri community, you might then be a mentor, and you could be a mentor in our farmer and rancher mentoring program. You could have, there's still resources, right, that you're going to need as an experienced farmer. So we have access to those for folks as well. But building in that framework of the producer pathway really provides support for folks at all stages of agriculture. And Groundwork is the same. When we have folks who come in who maybe they have gardened before and this is what they want to do, they might start at an intermediate level on our producer pathway. But for a lot of our folks in Groundwork, they start at that beginner level of the producer pathway. And our goal is really to get them to that intermediate stage, so, and then provide the resources they need at that stage to keep moving forward. And that includes the pieces like land access that we were talking about, which for us, if we don't have land, it might mean identifying partners who do. We have folks in Abingdon who might want to grow a garden, or maybe there's someone in Duffield who needs someone on their herb farm, or people who need agroforestry support who might have, limited physical ability due to age or other related things. And then we're working right now, this is kind of our third framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion, building in frameworks for addressing what limitations might exist for people to engage in agriculture. So what I just mentioned, talking about age-limited mobility, there's a lot of an aging population in Appalachia. So being able to provide support for those folks who might be aging, being able to provide support for folks who might have physical disabilities, because the physical disability rate in Appalachia is almost 3 or 4 times the national average, depending on where you are. So being able to provide direct support for those folks through Groundwork, along our producer pathway, and then in their own enterprises.
So it sounds, this idea of a pathway as an arc, meeting people where they are, but also knowing where they want to go, and then having the resources in place to really, help grow both the food and people in the ways. And you talked about 5 years is not sustainable. Totally hear that. So that's a way to help grow the person as a producer. How about the land? Talk a little bit about what those regenerative practices are on the land, and how you help people engage with those if that's something they want to do.
Thinking about regenerative practices and how we build that in, it comes in at a couple of stages. So for Groundwork, our Groundwork gardens, that for us can also be a testing site for some of those practices. One of our supervisors, for example, is exploring the concept of circular buffer strips as a natural pesticide control, as a natural water buffer. And what that is planting native pollinator vegetation in between your rows of regular vegetables. And so what that allows for is native plant growth. It allows for the soil to get fixed nutrients back into it. That's vital for plant growth. And it allows for native pollination. It allows for support of native pollinators. And it provides support for the plants themselves in that it reduces pests, among other things, and controls water. As we move, through the consequences of global climate change, flood control in Appalachia is going to be a significant issue. So the steps that we can take to protect farmers against the damage from flood control is huge. But we're able to use those as a kind of testing and demonstration site. And then I think, honestly, some of the best models of work that we've gotten are from our farmers who are part of our network. When we're looking at a 100-acre no-till pumpkin farm that someone has done, outside of our organization, we're able then to take people there on our field school or our business intensives or the learning programs we offer, and show them what that can look like. Here's how you can match production in a place that does no-till. And no-till just means you don't till the land. It's less damaging to the soil. But it takes a lot of practice to do it. And not everything grows well in a no-till system, full disclosure, but it can be really beneficial for the environment to do no-till systems. But what we do then is we partner with the farmers who are doing it best, who have those grown practices that are regenerative for land and soil and people. And we showcase those, with our support for our other farmers in our network. And then we help them identify maybe potential funding sources or potential partners, or we pair them up through our farmer and rancher mentoring so that they're able to learn what those practices can look like on their own land.
I love that connection point with the mentoring as well, continuing to find, sources of support in an ongoing way. That's awesome. Before we move into some questions more about joy in your own life, Hannah, I did want to ask you, you talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion and your own work, initially as a sustainability and equity VISTA position with ASD. Can you talk a little bit about how you're working to grow equity with folks you're working with, diversity, equity, inclusion within the Organization of Appalachian Sustainable Development, or broadly in the region? Can you talk a little bit about what your hopes are there, and what you feel like needs to happen to grow equity in a way that's really going to be lasting, knowing it's hard work?
So at ASD, I'm the chair of our equity committee, our diversity, equity, inclusion committee. And we host a monthly meeting where it's really a facilitated conversation that's based on self-learning. And I don't know, there's no way for me to say that that's the most effective model for equity. I'm by no means an equity expert. My background for equity work is a lot in the LGBTQ plus community and then the disabled community. So being able to work from those mindsets, but being able to draw to the forefront the education piece, the importance of self-education, that for marginalized groups, in Appalachia and beyond Appalachia, for a long time, the equity burden has been placed on people who identify as members of those marginalized groups to educate folks who are not. And so for me, my goal is always for our organization and for the region to emphasize the importance of that self-education piece
Mm-hmm.
and then be able to provide resources to do it. Making sure that we're, setting aside funding for equity educators, making sure that we're, doing readings, that we're doing trainings that are involved, that we're communicating the importance of these pieces in all of the work that we do. And then have had some really phenomenal support at the organizational level to build equity programming and practice into the grant applications that we write, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or to build those pieces into our programming. So
Mm-hmm.
when talking about Farmer Pride, if someone comes in and does our producer pathway tool, for example, Farmer Pride is identified as a resource at every level of that
Mm-hmm.
pathway. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're an LGBTQ plus person who's just maybe considering looking at herb gardening, that's still shared with you as a
Mm-hmm.
resource. If you're a person who's been doing this for 45 years, and you're chicken farming, that's shared with you as a resource
Mm-hmm.
because that's still able to anchor some of that support.
Mm-hmm.
And then looking, to really provide a basis where people can come and have a conversation. I
Mm-hmm.
like to use the term learning spaces because I
Mm-hmm.
feel like, a lot of folks use safe space, and I feel like that's difficult because you
Mm-hmm.
can't guarantee for the folks who have been marginalized in some capacity that a space is ever going to be safe.
Yeah.
Um, but being able to present it as a learning space so that folks who may have less experience and folks who may have a lot of experience with the topic are able to come and engage, and everyone's able to learn
Mm-hmm.
something, whether it's about where other folks are at or it's about to learn something about the topic itself, I think
Mm-hmm.
is a really vital piece of our mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I also heard you say earlier something, so essential of not placing additional burden on people who identify as being from marginalized communities to, educate others, but really, creating a greater sense of norming that people need to take the initiative to learn. Talked about self-learning and learning spaces, and also one of my mentors talked about brave space too, those brave learning spaces. So safe space, absolutely, you can't guarantee a safe space for other people, but we can create spaces where, there are agreements in place where people can show up to bring their whole selves and be brave together and learn together. So yeah, so important. So to get ready to wrap up, Hannah, I want to bring it back to you and your own life for some of our quick roller questions. You've talked a little bit about this, but tell us what brings you joy.
Honestly, I think this place in my life is definitely the happiest place I've been
Mm.
in a really long time. I'm back home,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not in Eastern Kentucky. I actually live in Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm in Appalachia,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being able to do really meaningful work um, here. I'm able to, I have my family that I love dearly and bring me a lot of support. I have some phenomenal friends. I have my community. I've got my LGBTQ plus community, for
Mm-hmm.
example, which really am able to engage with on a really deep level here,
Mm-hmm.
which has been phenomenal. The little things that bring me joy are like being out in our garden and seeing what that's going to look like, now in the spring when nothing looks particularly joyful. It looks like a lot of dirt, you know, and then looking at the end of the fall when we're doing harvest, and
Mm-hmm.
we've got a field of flowers and we've got, 6 months of hard work behind it, and you're able to see just the impact that that's made on a maybe a sillier level. Scented candles. Like I'm here
Mm-hmm.
for the scented candles and I'm here for, the good books and the kind of
Mm-hmm.
just being out in the trees, going for a walk every Sunday down on the greenbelt by the river is just a
Mm-hmm.
phenomenal place to be because I think it's a
Yeah.
very centering thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, love that. I started to ask people this because I realized in my own life the importance of focusing on what brings me joy. It's really easy to work really hard and to work a really long time and to get really burned out. And then, I found that I didn't have the energy to bring my best self forward and my family and my community and people I work with and really realize that prioritizing the things that bring me joy just brings so much energy to other parts of my life, but also for me and my heart and in my body and in myself, and just realize the importance of it. But it took me a long time. I'm 45 now. It took me like 43 years to realize that I needed to center that more.
Hey, I
Yeah.
love that question. I think that's a really fun question. And
Yeah.
again, throwing it back to what we were talking about earlier, I think that it's not a question people are asked all the time. And so just
Yeah.
the power in asking a question, I think,
Mm-hmm.
is a really
Yeah.
interesting thing.
What keeps you moving forward on the days you struggle? That's something that we don't talk about a lot as a culture, but I think is a really important part of that shared sense of community of doing the work of growth together, individually or together. What does that look like for you?
It's a hard question, and I think one of the things that this may sound like an odd answer, but my grandfather, who passed away several, my first year of college, but really one of my favorite people ever
Mm-hmm.
on the
Mm-hmm.
planet. Is a little Appalachian man, great guy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so he one time, and I remember this, I was like 7 or 8 years old, and I won't give the full context for it, but essentially, he said, you ought to be happy, Hannah Rose. There's no good reason to be sad. Uh, and then I was a little angry about that
Mm-hmm.
at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
then some other things happened, and we went down, and he clarified a little bit, and he said, uh, there's no good reason to be sad, but there's lots of good reasons to be angry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that transition and what he meant by it was in really a, honestly, justice context. I don't think,
Mm-hmm.
he was thinking about it too deeply at the time. But thinking about how that centered like joy and vitality can be an internal thing, right? That can
Mm-hmm.
come from internal, that can come from, gratitude for the things that I have in my life and coming from the love that I see from other people, or the love that I'm able to build for myself, in my own, whatever I'm doing at the time, and the own things that bring me joy and the hobbies and interests that I have. While still, I can be angry or I can be upset or I can be charged to
Mm-hmm.
action, I think is really what he meant.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about all of the things that are injustices and
Mm-hmm.
all of the things that need to be worked on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that creates a real drive, in that there are things to be angry about,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about Appalachian context, there's a lot,
Mm-hmm.
that when you think about it, get your blood boiling, as people will
Mm-hmm.
say.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, all the things we've talked about here, the joy that's come from the community and the sense of community that I really feel
Mm-hmm.
here, and
Mm-hmm.
the amount of love that's been shared for
Mm-hmm.
myself, for folks in our program, for members of Farmer Pride, for everybody else in our region, seeing that kind of support, like that is such an empowering thing. And then using that to keep your cup full, having
Mm-hmm.
those pieces to keep yourself motivated and keep yourself joyful, and being able to take breaks when you need it and be yourself still. And
Mm-hmm.
then being able to address all of that injustice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Keeping the awareness, not sugarcoating things, but also keeping your cup full. I love, there's a speaker and a writer I love, Lisa Nichols, who talks about keeping your cup full and overfilling and only giving from the saucer. Which just to me, like that analogy just resonates so much. So yeah,
I like
thanks for
that.
that. Yeah, and I love the grandparent. My grandma was a real special person in my life, and I had a dream about her a couple nights ago. So she's been like a real present part of my life this week. I feel like we've been hanging out this week a little bit, which has been pretty cool.
Oh, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So Hannah, tell us what key lessons learned would you share with others who are really trying to create change in their communities and region? What would you share out with folks? You've shared a lot of goodness already.
Yeah, I think honestly, the biggest thing for any person who's looking to enact change in a community is the first step has to be to listen to the community. That change has got to come not from yourself. You can be, and that's I think where damage gets done. You can be highly motivated to do something or think you know the problem, right,
Mm,
at its core. Um, and then if you're not asking the community what's wanted or needed or seen as a need, then you're missing the biggest piece,
mm-hmm,
right? Then you're only creating a further divide. Then you're
mm-hmm,
not building in the support structure that's really needed to build sustainable change. You
mm-hmm,
might fix a system, but you won't build a sustained system in the
mm-hmm,
process.
mm-hmm.
So I think listening is twice as vital as speaking. And being present can sometimes make the biggest difference.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, good words there. Yes. So as we get ready to wrap up today, it's really such a beautiful conversation. I want to just, open up for any other thoughts or reflections you'd like to share, Hannah, and tell us a little bit more about how people can learn about your work. You mentioned some links earlier, which we'll include, but anything else you want to share out, we welcome.
that's pretty much covered it. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk today. I really appreciate you having me on. Always love talking about Appalachia and just the phenomenal folks here and the work that's being done. I think if folks want to ever engage with ASD directly, we've got gardens in Tazewell and Abingdon. Folks are welcome to come out to those anytime. And I'll share, as you said, the links to our website or our web pages, and folks are welcome to engage there online as well and reach out with questions to whatever programs they might be interested in. We'd love to talk.
Great. Well, thank you for such a wise and also, really the sense of growth, both within gardens and people on land. It's just so evident the work that you're doing, Hannah, is just growing such amazingness. So thank you for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate that.
Hello, solution seekers and change makers. We are glad and grateful for the work you are doing in the world. To learn more about the stories and speakers featured in this episode, check out our website at yeswerise.org. You'll find the show notes, the interview videos, and the links mentioned today, and you can join our email list. Subscribe to the show to catch every new episode wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating or review. It so helps others find the podcast. You can also check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Yes We Rise to share your ideas. Enjoy.